Wild bears surround an unconscious forest ranger. You won't believe what happens next. The snow had come early to the Wind River Mountains, sweeping down from the high ridges with the silent force of something ancient and unrelenting. It blanketed the forest in thick, heavy white, silencing the world beneath a cold hush that swallowed sound and breath alike. Ethan Cross, 34 years old and a decade into his life as a forest ranger, stood alone in the modest ranger station nestled among the pine-draped slopes, staring at the flickering images on a trail cam monitor. The same 3 grizzlies again, third day in a row, same odd behavior. They hadn't approached anyone, hadn't knocked over garbage bins or raided food stores near the abandoned hunting cabins. They didn't growl, didn't flee, didn't attack. They simply stood, sometimes for hours, watching. It was the watching that made his spine crawl. Watching, but not like predators, more like sentinels or witnesses. Ethan zipped his jacket higher, grabbed his pack, and double-checked the gear inside: flare gun, satellite radio, high-calorie rations, first aid kit, emergency blanket, thermal gloves. He paused, looking at the radio. His gut whispered caution, but his curiosity whispered louder. Whatever this was, it was out there, and so was he. The wind had picked up by the time he stepped outside. It pressed against him with an icy persistence, biting through layers and tugging at the hem of his coat. His boots crunched over frozen soil and packed snow as he made his way along the narrowing trail that led up into the high pass toward the last recorded location of the grizzlies. Pines lined the path like solemn guardians, their limbs heavy with snow. Every now and then, the sharp cry of a raven broke the stillness, but otherwise, the forest was breathless. Ethan's breath came in shallow clouds as he climbed higher. The trail thinned, snaking around rock faces dusted in ice and cliffs where the snowdrifts crept like living things. He scanned for tracks, signs of disturbance, nothing but wind-carved patterns in the snow and the distant groan of trees underweight. The sun hung low and pale, smudged behind a wall of gray cloud. The weather was turning, he could feel it in his bones. Then, just as he reached a narrow ridge where the trees gave way to stark, wind-blown rock, the world disappeared beneath his feet. One step, that's all it took. What looked like solid snow had hidden an overhanging ice shelf. It gave way with a crack like a gunshot. Ethan fell, not far, maybe 10 feet, but it was enough. He landed hard, a jagged stone slamming into his thigh with a sickening crunch. His head snapped back against the frozen ground. The sky spun once, then faded to black. How long he lay there, he didn't know, minutes, hours. Snow drifted down like ash, whispering across his face. The cold was everywhere, in his clothes, his lungs, his bones. Pain pulsed through his leg like fire wrapped in frost. He tried to move, but a white-hot bolt of agony pinned him down. His radio, he reached weakly for it, but his fingers found only the shattered remains, cracked casing, no light, no sound. He was alone until he wasn't. A breath close, heavy. A sound. A low huff, not hostile, just present. Ethan forced his eyes open. Shapes, 3 massive, silent bears. The same bears. They stood in a loose circle around him, their dark eyes unreadable, their bodies still but alert. One took a slow step forward, head low, sniffing the air. Ethan couldn't move, could barely breathe. Instinct screamed, but reason, the small flicker of it still burning in his frozen mind, held him still. They didn't snarl, didn't raise hackles. The bear nearest to him turned, padded away into the trees. A moment later, it returned, carrying something in its mouth, moss, twigs, tufts of dried grass. It dropped them beside his head with delicate precision, then moved aside. Another, the largest of the three, lowered its massive body down beside Ethan's, settling into the snow with a deep exhale. Its warmth reached him instantly, the heat of its bulk seeping into his side like a fire wrapped in fur. Ethan's body, stiff with cold, drank it in. The third bear remained upright, facing into the wind, ears twitching, head high, sentry. Ethan wanted to speak, but his lips cracked when he tried. He wanted to ask why they were here, why they hadn't killed him, why they had come at all, but the words dissolved in his throat. The wind howled across the pass, lashing through the trees and shrieking between the stones. Snow fell faster now, erasing the trail behind him, closing the world to a tiny, frozen clearing with 3 bears and 1 broken man at its center. The storm grew teeth, and the bears stayed. Night fell with an eerie finality. Darkness closed in, not just in the sky, but in the bones. Ethan drifted, pain and cold pulling him under like deep water. Sometimes he stirred just enough to see the rise and fall of the bear beside him, the steady exhale of steam from its nostrils, the smell of fur, earth, life. Once, he reached out, gloved fingers brushing thick hair. It didn't pull away. Instead, it shifted, pressing closer. The storm roared, but in that strange huddle of man and beast, there was quiet, a silence, not of essence, but of understanding. Something ancient moved in that space, wordless and real. When morning came, it was not with warmth, but with light, dim gray light. A flicker of orange caught the edge of Ethan's blurred vision, the emergency blanket fluttering from his pack, where it had spilled. Far above, a drone of sound, a helicopter, distant at first, then louder. The wind picked up again, tearing through the trees with renewed ferocity. The bears reacted first. The one standing turned, huffing a breath that sounded almost resigned. The other shifted. The one beside Ethan rose slowly, lifting its massive body without a sound. For a moment, all 3 stood, watching him. Ethan, half-conscious, met their gaze. And then they turned, without fear, without hurry, and vanished into the trees. The medics came fast, ropes lowered, voices sharp and urgent, hands on him, stabilizing the leg, checking vitals, wrapping his body. "We've got him. He's alive," they shouted. Broken femur, possible concussion, hypothermic but responsive. One knelt beside him, eyes scanning the snow. He stopped, blinked. What the hell happened here? There were signs, insulation scattered, moss packed near Ethan's head, 3 sets of enormous tracks circling him in the snow, a flattened impression where something large had lain beside him all night. Ethan tried to speak. His lips cracked, voice one word, bears. The medic frowned. They attacked. Ethan shook his head slowly, wincing. Saved was all he could manage, but it was enough. The chopper lifted into the sky, carrying Ethan away from the place where the wild had done something no one would believe. And yet, the snow held its truth, pressed deep in its frozen heart, the shape of pause, the remnants of breath, and the quiet, impossible warmth of mercy. 6 weeks passed before Ethan Cross could walk without crutches. The bone had set clean, but the recovery was long and aching. A metal rod now ran the length of his femur, and his head throbbed with a dull hum when the weather shifted. Still, none of it haunted him like the silence in the hospital room when he first tried to explain what had happened on that ridge. They were just there, he told the doctor, his voice thin from exhaustion. They didn't attack. They stayed. One kept watch, one laid down with me, and one brought moss. They insulated me, kept me from freezing. The nurse, mid-adjusting his 4, had paused. Her eyes flicked to the doctor, who smiled gently but said nothing. That was the beginning of the doubt. Forest Service officials visited twice. Wildlife biologists from the University of Wyoming came too. They reviewed the trail camera footage, confirmed the presence of 3 adult grizzlies in the area, but dismissed the idea of coordinated, empathetic behavior. "They're bears," one said flatly. "Instinct, not empathy. Maybe you smelled like food. Maybe you landed near something they were already investigating." Ethan said nothing. He had already stopped trying to convince them. Words weren't enough, not for this, not for the thing that had no shape, no science, only presence, only warmth. What he couldn't explain was that feeling. Not just survival, not just the sheer odds of it all, but the feeling that something else had happened, that in the coldest moment of his life, the wild hadn't consumed him, it had cradled him. By spring, he was back in the mountains. Against the orders of his superiors, Ethan returned to the ridge alone. He wanted to see it again, not out of curiosity, but reverence. The trail was still icy in places, melting into slick mud and patches of brittle frost. The forest had begun to stretch, to breathe again. Pines shivered with meltwater, and streams burbled through thawed banks, life in quiet renewal. When Ethan reached the place, the narrow path where he'd fallen, he stopped. The snow had receded, revealing the moss-stained stones and the slight impression where his body had lain. He recognized the clearing, the rhythm of it, the way the trees stood like ancient guards around the perimeter. He felt it before he saw them, 3 dark shapes, motionless, on the far edge of the ridge. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not moving, not approaching, watching. Ethan froze. His heartbeat rose, not from fear, but something deeper, something that pulled at his chest like grief and awe combined. The bears made no sound. Their presence was quiet but monumental, like boulders holding breath. Ethan did not step closer. Instead, he reached up with one gloved hand and removed his hat. He bowed his head just slightly, then raised it again to meet their gaze. One of the bears blinked slowly. Another huffed a breath that carried across the cold air like a sigh. Then, as if in agreement, all 3 turned, first one, then the others, and disappeared into the trees. Ethan stood there for a long time after they left, breath shallow, the air still tinged with something sacred. That was the last time he saw them, but the feeling never left. Over the following months, the story spread in whispers, then in articles. The rescue team spoke of the tracks. The photos made it into niche nature blogs, then local papers. A few wildlife magazines picked it up under headlines like "Saved by Bears" and "Anomaly in the Wind Rivers." Still, the scientists scoffed. Empathy was not a bear's trait, they said, coincidence, instinct. But then the trail cameras caught something strange. In the dead of summer, long after Ethan's fall, the 3 grizzlies returned to the ridge, again and again. No food caches, no denning, just standing in the same place, noses to the wind, watching. The footage went viral. Questions bloomed, debate flared. Was it memory? Was it territorial? Or was it something else? By winter, Ethan had been invited to speak at a national wildlife conference in Denver. The stage was polished, the lights sterile, but Ethan stood in his ranger's coat, a faint limp in his step, and told a story not of science, but of connection. He showed the trail cam footage. He shared the data, backing the unusual clustering, the repeated returns of the same coordinates, the non-aggressive behavior. But then, he turned off the projector and stepped away from the podium. I want to tell you what I felt, he said, and that night wasn't about survival, not entirely. It was about what I saw in their eyes. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't confusion. It was attention, purpose. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were waiting to see if I'd make it. A murmur passed through the room. One hand rose, a woman in a gray blazer. Her voice was calm but skeptical. She asked the question that had always hung over Ethan's story: how do you know they meant to help? Ethan smiled, not defensive, just quiet. He looked down at his hands, then back to the room. Because they came back, he said. Not to feed, not to mark territory. They came back to the place where a human lay broken in the snow. Long after the threat had passed, long after the scent had faded, they came back, just to see, just to check. And I was there, watching them, just like they had watched me. Silence followed. Not doubt, something heavier, wonder. Ethan didn't stay for the full conference. He wasn't interested in debates or peer reviews. What had happened wasn't meant for classification, it was meant for something deeper. That spring, he returned to the forest station, but something inside him had shifted. The job was the same: managing trails, monitoring migration, responding to emergencies. But he moved through the woods with a different gait, a quieter step. He no longer saw the forest as a place he protected, he saw it as a place that had once protected him. That summer, when a cub was found orphaned near the eastern slope, Ethan volunteered to help transport it to a sanctuary. He held the trembling creature close in the back of the van, feeling its heartbeat against his chest. "You're not alone," he whispered. "None of us are." He believed that now. In a world full of sharp edges and survival, there were still moments, unexplainable, extraordinary, where nature bent toward compassion. He had seen it. He had lived because of it. And every time the wind shifted through the trees or a shape moved between the pines, he looked up, not with fear, but with a silent greeting, just in case. Autumn draped the Wind River Mountains in fire and rust, turning the evergreens into pillars among seas of amber and gold. The air sharpened with each passing day, carrying the scent of pine and the first whisper of snow. Ethan Cross returned to the trailhead earlier than usual that season, his breath already visible in the morning light. Though he told himself it was for maintenance, to check the fire lines and ensure the late hikers had marked their waypoints, he knew it was something else. A pull, a presence. That ridge still called to him. Not in fear, not in memory, but as if something remained unfinished. He hadn't seen the bears since spring, since that single distant encounter when they'd stood like statues on the edge of the world. But their absence hadn't erased their presence. It lingered like a shadow in sunlight, just out of reach, just behind the trees. With every sunrise, Ethan felt a growing need to return. Not to see, but to honor. The hike took longer than it used to. The legs still stiffened in the cold, and the scar across his temple itched when the wind hit just right, but Ethan moved with purpose. Not hurried, not cautious, just steady. The forest welcomed him in its own way, with the soft crackle of drying leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a branch echoing through the stillness. Squirrels darted through the underbrush. A fox watched him pass from the shelter of a fallen log. And somewhere deep beyond the trees, something else listened. He reached the ridge by midday. The sun filtered through thinning clouds, casting long slants of light across the rock face. There was no sound save the distant murmur of wind high above. Ethan stepped into the clearing, the place where he'd fallen, where he'd nearly died, and where something impossibly gentle had saved him. The moss was dry now, the snow gone, but the shape remained, a depression in the earth, subtle but present, where something heavy had once lain beside him through a night no human should have survived. He knelt, gloved fingers brushing the dirt. He said nothing. There was nothing to say, only to feel, only to remember. He stayed for hours, letting the cold rise slowly around him. No bears appeared, no distant figures, but he didn't feel alone. When the light began to wane, he unfolded the emergency blanket from his pack, not out of necessity, but ritual, and spread it across the ground. He sat on it cross-legged, facing the line of trees where he had last seen them. The silence was profound, not empty, full of breath and memory of moments lived beneath fur and frost. And when he finally rose to leave, he did so slowly, with the quiet reverence of someone leaving a sacred place. That night, as he returned to the ranger station and set down his pack, his phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Lynn Marlowe, the lead wildlife biologist who'd once dismissed his account as emotional projection. "Ethan," it read, "you need to see the latest trail cam footage. Call me." He did. She didn't greet him. She just said, "They came back again." A pause. Same time as last year. Same pattern. No food. No territory markers. They just stood there. Ethan sat back, the chair creaking beneath him. "Where?" he asked. "Same ridge." She replied, "Your ridge." A long silence passed between them. "I'm starting to think we're wrong," she admitted softly. "About a lot of things." The footage arrived the next day. Ethan watched it in his office, the small monitor flickering as it played. The timestamp showed a date exactly 1 year from the night he had fallen. The bears were there, 3 of them, standing still, their breath visible in the cold. One sniffed the ground, one sat. The third paced a slow, deliberate circle around the center of the clearing before lying down, exactly where Ethan had been. They stayed until dawn, then vanished into the trees as if answering some quiet signal that only they could hear. He watched the footage again and again. Each time, a weight pressed deeper into his chest, not of confusion, but of recognition. That winter, Ethan began collecting data, not for reports, not for scientific validation, but for truth, for story. He gathered historical cases, accounts of animals displaying behaviors that didn't fit the accepted models. Wolves protecting injured elk calves, a deer standing vigil over a dying fox, accounts mostly ignored or dismissed. He compiled them in a leather-bound notebook, pages filled with scrawled notes, maps, sketches, and reflections in the margins. He often wrote words like "why" or "what does this mean?" But the question he wrote most often was one he could never fully answer: what if they remember? When spring came, he returned to the ridge again, this time with no pack, no gear, only the notebook. He sat beneath the trees for hours, watching the light shift. A bird landed nearby, cocking its head at him. The forest moved gently around him, a twig snapped somewhere behind him. He didn't turn. He just smiled. He knew they wouldn't appear now. This was not their time. This was his time, to wait, to watch, to learn. Ethan's story continued to spread, picked up by nature documentarians, featured on podcasts, mentioned in lectures. Some mocked, others marveled, but the core never changed. A man fell, 3 bears stood, and something passed between species that defied logic but not meaning. A connection formed, not by words but by breath shared beneath a storm. Later that year, a wildlife team placed an acoustic recorder on the ridge. It was meant to capture migration patterns, howls, calls, seasonal movements. When they reviewed the audio 2 months later, they found something else. In the middle of a quiet night, 3 long breaths, not wind, not echo, 3 exhalations, one after another. Then, nothing, as if the forest itself had sighed. When Ethan listened to it, he closed his eyes. He could still feel the weight of fur against his ribs, the beat of a massive heart so close to his own. He didn't tell anyone what he thought it meant. He didn't have to. Some things aren't meant to be explained, only witnessed, only honored. So he did, in his own quiet ways, by planting spruce saplings along the ridgeline, by building a small cavern of stones in the shape of a triangle, just like the way they had stood around him, by leaving a strip of emergency blanket each winter tucked beneath a pine root, a symbol of memory. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, and the clouds rolled heavy across the peaks, he would sit by the fire in the station and close his eyes. He would remember, not the fall, not the pain, but the moment he woke, cold, broken, and saw that he was not alone, that something immense and wild had chosen to stay. The conference hall in Vancouver was colder than it needed to be, the kind of institutional chill that seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Ethan stood backstage, his palms pressed together, breathing slowly through his nose, trying to anchor himself to the moment. 2 years had passed since that night on the ridge, since the bears, the snow, and the breath that had not been his own had carried him through death's waiting room and into something new. He wasn't the same man anymore, not just because of the metal in his leg or the quiet ache in his head when storms rolled through, but because of what that moment had done to the deepest part of him. He hadn't spoken of it often, not like this, not in front of strangers with credentials and skepticism and questions that sharpened like scalpels. But the invitation had come months ago, hand-delivered by Dr. Lynn Marlowe herself. "They're finally ready to listen," she had said, a smile flickering beneath her weariness. "And you're the only one who can tell it right." So he had come, notebook in hand, trail cam footage on a USB stick, and one truth trembling behind every breath: connection exists in places we've forgotten how to see. When they called his name, he stepped into the light. The audience was larger than he expected: wildlife professionals, conservationists, behaviorists, students with notepads and wide eyes. The screen behind him flickered to life, showing a still image of the Wind River Ridge, winter-heavy and windswept. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he looked out across the room, trying to find someone, anyone, who might already understand. He started not with data, but with a story: a man tracking strange bear behavior, a fall, a storm. 3 massive animals who should have turned away or turned against, but instead stayed, shared, protected. He told them of the moss, the warmth, the night spent wrapped in breath that was not his. He described waking to see them still there, unmoving in the snow, guarding something they could not name but seemed to understand. When the footage played, the slow, deliberate return of the bears to the same place, months after the incident, a hush fell over the room. No fidgeting, no coughs, just silence, deep and echoing. The final image lingered, the 3 bears, side by side, staring toward the camera as if looking through it into the eyes of whoever dared watch. When Ethan stepped away from the podium, the moderator thanked him and opened the floor to questions. At first, none came. Then, a woman rose, a young voice, steady but cautious. "Do you think they remember you, specifically you?" Ethan smiled, not surprised by the question. "I don't know," he said, "but I remember them. And I think that's part of the point. Connection doesn't require symmetry, just presence. Just choice." Another hand, a man in a weather jacket, biologist by the look of him. "You said they came back repeatedly, But how do you know they meant to help? That it wasn't just coincidence, curiosity, leftover instinct. Ethan paused, his gaze dropping briefly to his notebook. He opened it, flipping to the page where he'd written a line months ago, scrawled in the early morning hours after waking from a dream of paw prints and breath clouds. Because they came back, he said again, slowly. Not for food, not for shelter, just to check. And there's no instinct in that. That's something else. The room was silent again, then applause, quiet at first, then building, not loud, not theatrical, but real. A few stood, a few wiped their eyes. Lynn met him off stage, her smile small but shining. They heard you, she said. Maybe not all of them, but enough. That night, Ethan walked alone beneath the city's glow, the sky smudged with light and fog, the stars lost to the electric noise. He missed the dark, the deep dark of the mountains, the kind that wasn't empty but full of wind and branch and ancient breath. He missed the ridge, and even more than that, he missed the moment between waking and death when he had looked into the eyes of a creature wild beyond measure and had not seen hunger, but recognition. Back in Wyoming, spring came late. Snow clung to the shadows, reluctant to leave. Ethan returned to the ridge in early May, hiking slow but steady, his breath fogging in the high mountain air. He carried no pack this time, only the notebook and a single thermos of coffee. When he reached the clearing, he didn't expect them to be there, and they weren't. The space was empty, wind-blown and quiet, but the ground bore the memory of their visits, tracks faded into soil, a piece of moss disturbed just slightly, as if someone had knelt there recently. He sat at the center, legs folded, hands resting on his knees. He didn't speak. There was no need. He poured a small measure of coffee into the cap of his thermos and set it gently on the ground, an offering, a gesture, a shared ritual, even if unseen. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Somewhere, a raven called. Somewhere, a creek whispered. And though the ridge remained empty, Ethan felt watched, not threatened, witnessed. And in that witnessing, something softened, something settled. He stayed until the light began to fade, then rose slowly and turned back toward the trail. As he walked, he glanced once over his shoulder. Nothing moved, but he smiled anyway because it wasn't about seeing, it was about knowing. Months later, a letter arrived at the station. There was no return address, just a single sheet inside, typed in a simple font. I read your story, it said. I believed none of it. Then, on a hike in northern Montana, I found myself surrounded by 3 bears. They did not attack, they did not flee. They sat for hours. I thought of you. I thought of what you said. I just wanted to tell you I understand now. Ethan folded the letter and tucked it into the back of his notebook, beside pressed leaves, torn maps, and scribbled fragments of thought. The notebook was nearly full, but his story wasn't. That fall, he gave a talk, not to scientists, but to children, 3rd graders in a classroom lined with paper trees and glittering snowflakes. He showed no footage, only told the story. He described the snow, the fall, the cold. Then he asked a simple question: what would you do if something hurt and someone came close, not to attack, but to stay with you? One small hand shot up. I'd stay with them too, the child said. So they're not alone? Ethan nodded, heart tight. Exactly. And maybe that was what it all came down to, not science, or myth, or wild anomalies, but presence. The refusal to let another soul be alone when they are most broken. And if a bear, a creature shaped by hunger and fear and the oldest instincts of the earth, could choose that, then maybe so could we. Maybe it was never about understanding them, maybe it was about remembering ourselves. He never saw the three again, but sometimes in the silence before sleep, he swore he could hear them breathing, not close, not threatening, just there, as if the memory of that night still lived in the forest, in the snow, in the air between stars. And whenever he closed his eyes on the coldest nights, he did so with gratitude, not for the warmth that saved him, but for the truth that came with it, that the world is not as divided as we think, that sometimes mercy walks on four legs, and sometimes it watches us long after we've gone, just to be sure we made it home. Snow fell again on the ridge 2 winters later, thick and quiet, covering the ground like a shroud of memory. Ethan Cross stood at the edge of the treeline, breath rising in slow curls, his hand resting on the trunk of a wind-bent pine. He was older now, not in years so much as in stillness. The mountains had shaped him since that fateful day, hollowing out the noise that used to fill his life and replacing it with something he couldn't name but carried everywhere. It had been 4 years since the fall, since the 3 bears had surrounded him in the storm. The world had moved on. The media stories had faded, the curiosity of scientists had shifted toward newer headlines, and the conference videos had stopped circulating. But Ethan never left, not really. His body moved between towns and stations, his voice spoke on podcasts and panels, but something of him remained in the trees, in the moss, in the breathless silence of that night when the impossible had sat beside him and shared its warmth. He had never stopped returning to the ridge, season after season, storm after storm. He made the hike with the same reverence someone might carry to a grave or a chapel, not to look for them. He no longer needed to see them. It was enough to be near the place where everything had changed. This time, though, he had come to say goodbye, not to the forest, not to the bears, but to the version of himself that had needed the story to stay alive. He had done the work, shared the truth, honored the mystery, followed the threads through research and speech and sleepless nights. He had written it all down, every moment, every breath. And now, the pages were bound, leather-wrapped, and stitched with care, ready to leave his hands. A publisher had asked for a memoir months ago, hesitant but intrigued. "Only if it's honest," he had said. "Even if it sounds unbelievable." They had agreed. The book was done, the final draft had been sent. But Ethan hadn't felt peace until this morning when he woke with the simple certainty that it was time to return once more, one last time. Snow whispered around his boots as he stepped into the clearing. The ridge looked the same, silent, raw, and wide, but something in the air felt different. He didn't question it, he simply walked to the center of the clearing and knelt, resting the notebook on a flat stone where the wind wouldn't take it. The cover bore no title, just a small embossed emblem, 3 bear silhouettes facing outward from a center point, a symbol he'd drawn hundreds of times without ever fully knowing why. He stared at the book for a long moment, then touched it lightly, fingers cold through his gloves. "This is for you," he whispered. "For all of you." He didn't expect an answer, but he got one anyway. A sound, soft and steady, rose behind him, snow crunching under weight, not fast, not furtive, just deliberate. He turned his head slowly, and there they were, not in shadow, not in memory, but real, present, and breathing. The 3 grizzlies stood just inside the treeline, their massive bodies motionless in the falling snow. They hadn't aged, at least not in any way he could tell. Their eyes were the same, dark, deep, and impossibly knowing. They didn't move closer. They didn't need to. He felt them the way you feel the sun on your back or the echo of a heartbeat in your chest. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say, only to be. The silence that followed was not absence, it was reverence, the kind of stillness that speaks louder than words. He knelt there in the snow, the notebook before him, the bears watching. And in that moment, something passed between them, not a goodbye, not an ending, but a recognition. You lived. We remember. After a long while, the smallest of the bears, the one who had laid beside him all those years ago, shifted its weight and exhaled. The sound carried through the cold like a benediction. Then, one by one, they turned, not hurried, not reluctant, just ready, and they walked into the trees, disappearing between the trunks with the grace of smoke. Ethan remained kneeling long after they were gone. His face was wet, not from snow, but from tears that had come without sadness. When he finally rose, he left the notebook where it was. It wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the place, to the memory, to whatever lives in the space between survival and grace. The hike down was slow. He didn't rush. The wind followed him, gentle like a hand on his shoulder. At the base of the trail, a car waited. Lynn's headlights dimmed. Her figure was visible in the passenger seat. She stepped out when she saw him, wrapped in a long coat, a thermos in her hands. "You okay?" she asked as he approached. He nodded. "I think I've been okay for a while," he said. "I just didn't know how to let go." She handed him the thermos, coffee still warm. "Then this is it?" He looked back toward the tree line. "For them. Maybe for me. I think it's just beginning." She smiled and opened the passenger door. "Well then, let's get you home." As the car pulled away, the snow continued to fall, erasing his tracks behind them, but not the memory, never the memory. Weeks later, the book was released under the title The Ridge. Reviews called it poetic, haunting, and plausible. Some readers believed, some did not, but all agreed on one thing: it was a story that stayed with you. Ethan didn't care about sales. He didn't care about interviews or panels or podcast requests. What mattered was something quieter. Letters began arriving, handwritten, typed, emailed, from around the world. People who had seen strange kindness from wild creatures. People who had felt watched when no one was there. People who simply needed to believe that the wild could love them back. Ethan read them all, replied to most, but the one that meant the most came from a child in Alberta. It was scrawled in colored pencil on lined notebook paper. "Dear Mr. Ethan," it read, "thank you for not being afraid. I think the bears loved you because you were out and quiet and didn't yell at them. I think the forest knows when someone is gentle. When I grow up, I want to live in a place like that too." Ethan framed that letter. It hung in his cabin by the window, next to a photograph of the ridge covered in snow. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the wind howled down from the peaks and the trees swayed like dancers in the dark, he would sit by the fire and close his eyes. And he would feel them, not in body, but in presence. 3 breaths, one after another. And he would smile, because they were not gone. They never had been.